Oftentimes, as I have in the past years dialogued with people from various walks of life who are teachers, some at universities, some at seminaries, colleges, and so forth. You know, there are teachers in our land teaching in the universities. They're teaching comparative religions, and some of them will say that Christianity is a very, very harsh, unloving religion, and they will go to texts like what we have today. And you know, what do we say about that? I mean, when you study the Bible, you discover that there is a lot of... God says that certain sins are to be punished by taking the person's life, right? In our modern society, doesn't it cringe you just a little bit when it says that those who are witnesses are to throw the first stones? And then the rest after that until the person is dead. You say, that's so harsh. Is the Bible just full of harshness? No, it's not. And that's a misnomer to interpret it that way. But in a society that continually more and more seeks to take away the boundary lines and to accept all things as having some value and some good, why does God give us these hard set lines? Well, it's because of this, at least in my understanding. It's because we cannot fathom the holiness of God. If we begin to fathom the holiness of God, at least as much as we're able to, then we understand how deeply egregious it is that those whom He has created in His image would worship the stars, or worship the moon or the sun, or worship some log that they carve out. I remember in the Philippines when we were there, it was Guatemala. We were up in the mountains, and I think I mentioned this before. There's a tribe there that they believe that there's this log that is their god. And there are priests that they carry it 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They trade off. It never, ever is set down. 2 men are carrying this log all the time. Then they'll switch off. They carry it for a couple of hours, and then they switch off. And this is their God. And you say, well, Tim, they're just deluded. They're ignorant of the truth. Well, this is true, although the truth has come to them. Because the man that took me up to Consaltenango and up in that region, he has given them the gospel. Even the Bible in a language that they're able to read. It's not their own tribal language, but language they're able to read. And we think, well, why couldn't God just say, well, they're okay, they're ignorant. No, He can't. And He will not. And that's because God is kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. Right? Holy, holy, holy. When you find something repeated 3 times in a row without any words in between, you start thinking, maybe I should think that's really important. It is important. We see this, we get the picture of this primarily from the Tanakh, because in the Apostolic Scriptures, the Apostolic writers expect that you have read the Tanakh. They expect that you know that, right? So when it says no man can see God and live. Oh, he's too distant. No, He's with us in our midst. What does that mean? It means no man can come to know God fully by simply chumming around with Him. The elders and Moshe and Aaron saw Him, right? Exodus 24 says they went up the mountain and they saw the God of Israel. Right? And so it isn't that he doesn't reveal Himself. It isn't that He doesn't make Himself known. It is that we really cannot, if you think of the greatest measure of holiness, that still hasn't filled the infinite holiness of God. And that means that he cannot have a loving, friendly relationship with anyone whose sin has not been atoned for. Now, don't get me wrong. He is benevolent to all men, to all people, men and women everywhere, even to those who are idolaters. How is his benevolence? How is his love shown? He sends the rain upon the just and the unjust. Right? He supplies food. He even supplies breath and life. His love is found in many places, but he will not strike a covenant relationship with that person. He will not strike a covenant relationship of eternity with that person until their sin has been paid for. Now, there's only one way for sin to be paid for. And that's if there is a sinless life that is given for the sinner. And there's only been one person in this whole universe who has ever lived and is a sinless life, who has blood in his veins, and it is Yeshua. You say, well, why? God is just a bloodthirsty God. Why does he have to have death in order to atone for sin? Let me give you the best answer I can. My dad taught me this when I was a little boy. He's the one that makes the rules. Go ask him. In other words, we fall before him and we say, you are king. You make the rules. You have every right to make the universe the way you intend. And to prove that he is not an angry God, like so many of the pagan gods are angry gods. If you don't satisfy them, you're in big trouble. No. How do we know that he's not an angry God? In this is love, that he sent his Son and gave him for us. And does he win or does he lose? Is God the winning one or the losing one? He wins. A group of people that no one can number, from every tribe, from every family, from every language group, throughout all the generations of the world, will stand before him and be trophies of his love and grace. And we have the privilege of being part of that group. Okay, I have a hand over here. Do we have a microphone? We can get a microphone. Thanks, Alex. Appreciate it. So when you read the Tanakh, as you read and you say, boy, there's an awful lot of capital punishment going on here, remember that it's to tell us and to teach us about God's holiness. You know, I was thinking as the passages were being read today, it's hard to consider, but it's true if you read your history, that at least to one measure, or some measure, I'll say, these texts formed the basis for how leaders of our country were to be chosen. There were certain criteria. A king couldn't be from a foreign people in Israel, right? And guess what? The President of the United States has to be a citizen of the United States and not from a foreign country. Where did they get that? They got it right out of the Bible. And what about judges who take bribes? Major punishment. Where did they get that? I guarantee you, if you go to Africa, you'll find all kinds of judges that take bribes. I've seen it happen. Yeah, Southeast Asia, you bet. Don't you wish that there could be a criteria that is required before people could run for office? That here's the criteria you must measure up to before we will put you forward to have authority over a group of people in a state, in a city, in a county, in a nation here in the United States. We're coming to some election times, and sometimes I wring my hands. I say, how do we vote? I think if we haven't spent plenty of time in prayer that God would give us leaders that would honor him, then we probably don't have a good reason to vote. This is an issue throughout the history of the world. If you study world history, you discover that as a nation or a group of people, even if they're not admitting that they're following the ways of God, if they do follow God's ways, there is a blessing. God's ways work. They bring about a good result. And of course, they work best when the motive in such a way of working is from a heart to love Him. So what's the very first... By the way, what's the word Decalogue mean anyway? 10 words, which is exactly how it's always spoken of in the Bible itself, the 10 words. Well, there's more than 10 words in the 10 Commandments, right? So what does that mean? 10 things, 10 important nuggets. And what's the first one? I am Adonai your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt. Now that's not listed first if you're reading some of the Christian lists, because they leave that one out and they divide another one to get 10. But that is the first word. This opening of the 10 words, or 10 commandments, if you've learned them that way, is a summary of the whole, for it establishes the relationship between Israel and God, and shows that this relationship came about by the act of His having chosen her and redeemed her out of Egypt. It is fitting, then, that the second of the 10 words prohibits the worship of any other god or the use of idols in worship. Right? If God is the one who has redeemed you out of slavery, then most certainly you should give all worship to Him and to nothing else and no one else. Idolatry in all of its modes is obviously and completely devastating to the establishment of the covenant God has forged with His people. This is so because all worship, whether genuine or false, affects all aspects of life. Is that too broad of a statement? Well, we need to always expand our understanding of what the word worship means. We worship God in word, in deed, in thought. Right? Worship means to live life His way, and in so doing to give Him the honor. Therefore, every part of our life touches an aspect of worship. What does worship mean anyway? It means to give up my will in favor of the one I worship. Right? It means to give up my will, or to give over my will to the one that I worship. Now you say, well, but wait a minute. Am I not supposed to submit to my employer? I give up my will. Yes, but you do that because you do it as unto the Lord. Right? Because that's what God said to do. Submit to those who have the rule over you. Okay? So when we submit to one another, it still is an act of obeying God, which ultimately is an act of worship. Obedience to God is a life of worship. All too often we compartmentalize into secular and sacred. There's no such thing. If we're children of the Lord, there's no such thing as secular. Everything we do, we must do as unto the Lord. You say, well, Tim, it hardly seems possible that I spend my whole day down at Discount Tire changing tires and that's unto the Lord. Yes, it is. The way that you are honest, the way that you work well, the way that you give, you say yes to those who have the authority to tell you to do it this way and not that way. The way you don't, how you carefully guard your tongue when you slip with the wrench and scar your knuckles. Now, is anyone perfect in that worship? No. No, we're not perfect, but we're seeking to be. We're seeking to be more and more like Yeshua.
How is that different than honor?
How is worship different than honor? It's an overlap. When you honor someone who is worthy to be honored, you're doing it, if you have it in your mind, you're saying, Lord, you told me to honor those that I'm supposed to honor. Right? It's obedience to Him, isn't it? When I do my work well, it's obedience to Him. When I have joy in this life, what do the Scriptures say? Paul says, rejoice. Oh, and in that case you forgot it. And again I say, rejoice.
Sometimes you'll honor people because of their status in government.
Okay. Yeah, no, you don't worship the person necessarily, obviously, that you honor, but you worship the one who told you to honor. Right? This was one of the important aspects when during the time of the Reformation there was this re-understanding of what worship really was. Because let's face it, the Christian church, particularly the Roman Catholic Church, held sway for hundreds of years. If you wanted to worship, you had to do it the way you were supposed to, at the place you were supposed to, when you were supposed to, toward the person who was leading the worship, etc., etc. You had trinkets that you had to use. You had things that you had to use to worship. And if you didn't do it right, you weren't worshiping. And what did that all lead to? That I worship one day a week. I worship one part of one day a week. Let's go to worship. We have the worship service. Well, there's nothing wrong with that term. Because there's corporate worship, there's individual worship, and so forth. But worship is the broadest perspective of what it means to be a child of God. I think sometimes, I kind of got on a tangent here, sorry, but I think sometimes, as Americans, we don't understand this nearly as well as some of the earlier generations did in Europe who had kings and queens. You know, there was a time when if you did the wrong thing in the presence of a king or a queen, you could lose your life, even if you didn't intend to. There was a sense of my whole life is somehow governed by these people. I had better be very careful how I speak about them. You understand what I'm saying? Okay, now, what about God, who is king of all the universe? So we have to kind of get rid of this secular, sacred thing and recognize that the things that are, in our view, mundane, are in God's view not mundane at all. They are the necessary things of life which we do in a way to honor Him. Some of us have to constantly remind ourselves about that with foot on the gas pedal, because we'd like to get there quicker than slower, right? But are we not supposed to obey the laws? Yes, even if we think that they're not all that great. Now, the only time that we don't obey the law that's set forth in our country is when it's contrary to what God has said. Whether we should obey God or man, Peter says, you tell us. The answer is obvious. We will obey God, even if it requires us to be punished for it. And that's happened throughout history amongst those who were true believers. Okay, I see a hand, another hand. Do we have a microphone? Oh, it's right up here. Margaret Gonzalez. Yeah.
So I guess it's not necessarily secular and sacred. It's more like godly character and ungodly character.
Exactly. And do you notice that the Bible doesn't talk about neutral? It says either you're honoring God or you're dishonoring Him. So we have to broaden our understanding of what it means to honor God. When we do what is right, when we do what is appropriate, when we do what is according to His ways, we are honoring Him. Whether we're working on our car, or whether we're working at our work, or whether we're taking a vacation, or whether we're, whatever. Broaden the circle of worship to one's whole life. It affects all of life, legal, religious, economic, social, and civil. God reveals to us in the opening word of the 10 that if Israel were to engage in idolatry, it would bring about her ruin and cause her to fail in accomplishing the mission for which she was created. In our portion, and by the way, why was Israel created as a nation? To give honor to the Lord. In our portion this Shabbat, we have a specific instruction based in a most foundational way upon the first words of the Decalogue. Here, with the setting of the theocratic, that is, God ruling, the divine rule of Adonai in view, we have the statutes regarding what is to be done when idol worship is discovered. From these instructions, we may glean timeless principles for our own worship and gain a glimpse into the character and attributes of God Himself. Our text opens with a prohibition against bringing a defective animal as a sacrifice to God. Such a practice is abhorrent to the Lord. And it really is the word toivah. It's used in regard to homosexuality, in eating meat from unclean animals, of foreign gods in general, as well as the custom of the foreign nations, that is, customs connected with idolatrous worship. It is a strong word, usually translated abomination or something to that effect, and shows that God has no place whatsoever for worship that has any connection with idols. He neither can tolerate it, nor will He allow its inclusion into the worship He has prescribed. Being able to look at this prohibition after the coming of Messiah gives us the advantage of seeing the picture more fully. God's unflinching position on the issue of idolatry or any kind of syncretism. Syncretism is when you join two things together which are opposed, things which essentially differ. Syncretism clearly foreshadows the unique and holy sacrifice of Yeshua, and that's the primary issue. All of this was given. The sacrifices, the clean and unclean laws, the laws of ritual purity and all of that were given to show that there has to be a separation between what is idolatrous and what is the worship of God. You can't mix the two. He will not accept it. For to have offered a defective sacrifice would have been to muddy the picture of Yeshua's sacrificial death. What we learn instead is that the sacrifice of Yeshua, to which every sacrifice in the tabernacle and the temple pointed, was in every way perfect and therefore was fully accepted by the Father as accomplishing its goal. It is this impeccable character of Yeshua's self-sacrifice that makes it fully acceptable before the Father, and by which we may be assured that our sins have, in fact, been entirely expunged before the bar of God's justice. And excuse me for reminiscing about old hymns, but this is one by Toplady that is one of my favorites, at least by way of the wording. From whence this fear and unbelief? Hath not the Father put to grief his spotless Son for me? And will the righteous judge of men condemn me for the debt of sin which, Lord, was charged to thee? Complete atonement thou hast made, and to the utmost farthing paid whate'er thy people owed. Nor can his wrath on me take place, if sheltered in thy righteousness and sprinkled with thy blood. If thou hast my discharge procured, and freely in my room endured the whole of wrath divine, payment God cannot twice demand, first at my bleeding surety's hand, and then again at mine. Turn then my soul unto thy rest. The merits of thy great high priest have bought thy liberty. Trust in his efficacious blood, nor fear thy banishment from God, since Jesus died for thee. Thus we may also learn something about the character of God from this, namely, that He will accept nothing that detracts from the perfections of His Son. Now we may take this to heart as we approach our own worship. Are there things in which we engage that detract from the glory and perfection of Yeshua? Do we in any way bring, as it were, a defective sacrifice to our worship, which by its defect detracts from the very sacrifice of Yeshua that is essential to all of our worship? What would constitute such a defect? First, believing that we contribute at least part of the price of our redemption. What does salvation by works, what is it? It's no salvation at all. Why? Because our works don't amount to anything in relationship to what was owed. Secondly, emphasizing the success of the congregation to the exclusion of giving the glory to Yeshua as the head and master of our community. I've watched groups become big and prosperous, building huge buildings, many, duplicating themselves all over the country. And I'm not saying that that's wrong at all. But there's always that temptation to say, we really have it. We've got it. We've done it. No. Even where two or three are gathered together, God is there ready to be the judge of what is right and what is wrong. Failing to speak forth the work of Yeshua for fear of those who have rejected Him. We've all experienced this. I don't think there's one of us that haven't. We've been in a situation where we were urged perhaps to share the gospel with somebody, but we thought, well, this really isn't the place. This really isn't, I don't know how he'll take it, so forth and so on. Well, if the Lord is urging us to say something, we had better say it. And if the Lord tells us to be quiet, we should keep quiet. You're absolutely right. This is wisdom. Compromising our beliefs in Yeshua as the only means of salvation in order to be accepted by others. This is happening in our movement today. Whatever you want to call this, a Torah movement or whatever. There are those who are saying, well, observant Jewish people who have rejected Yeshua and said he's a false Messiah, God's going to accept them anyway because they're doing so many good things. No. If you confess with your mouth, that's pretty clear, isn't it? If you confess with your mouth that Yeshua is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. Paul's pretty clear about that. I think we should be too. Now, it doesn't mean that we're judges of who's saved and who's not saved in every way. Someone who's living an ungodly life, you have a big question mark over where they are in their relationship with God. But God is the ultimate judge. We don't judge the hearts. We can warn somebody saying, if you're truly born from above, if you truly have the Spirit of God within you, the things that you're doing and living are contrary. We should encourage and exhort, but we cannot ultimately judge. But while bringing a defective sacrifice is clearly linked with idolatry in our text, it is nonetheless far less overt than what the Parashah goes on to describe, that is, actually worshiping other gods. We might note, however, that the fact that the two are linked together by their close proximity should warn us that overt idolatry begins with the neglect of God's prescriptions regarding worship in the first place. I was just amazed at our house. I'm walking up the front steps, and our front steps are solid cement. Okay? Solid cement. 3 steps up before the fourth one up to the porch. And they're solid cement. We didn't pour them. They were there when we bought the house. Out of a tiny little crack, right in the middle, something's growing. Yes, and what is that weed that grows that? Morning glory. Why is it that the things that you want to bloom, you have to just pamper and protect and water, but morning glory will grow no matter where without any attention or anything? And the interesting thing is that when a plant grows in a little crack, it doesn't split the cement all at once. It splits it a little at a time. And that's what happens when we begin to neglect the things of God that are laid out clearly in the Scriptures. We say, well, that one's for somebody else. That's for a long time ago. We don't need to do that. We don't need to care about that. It's not on our plate to do. Whew. That was one of my big problems with a certain hermeneutic that I was taught in seminary, and it was that God's laws are only for this time and not for this time. And I say, well, how do you know that? As soon as somebody tells us this part of the Bible doesn't apply to you, then who becomes the judge of what does apply? Man. We have to be very careful with that. Now, granted, there are certain laws given to women that are not given to men, and vice versa. Certain laws given to kings, certain laws given to, we understand that. That's very clear in the Scriptures. But there are certain things that God expects and commands of us all. And they all start with the heart to say, yes, Lord, and that's the essence of worship. While bringing a defective sacrifice is clearly linked with idolatry, it is less overt, as I said, than actually worshiping other gods. An idol, bowing down to some whatever. What is striking about the section, which is before us, is the unbending severity demanded of Israel in regard to punishing the idolatry, as well as the corresponding wrath which God himself displays. Why? A little leaven leavens the whole lump. There is no mercy here. Brazen idolatry has taken the sinner beyond the place of return. Our text specifically prohibits the worship of the sun or moon or the stars. This specific prohibition is found only here in the Torah, and no doubt is directed toward a paganism that Israel had encountered among her neighbors and with which she perhaps was flirting. Do you know that you find astrology texts amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls? We don't know exactly all that they, how far they went with that, but did they believe that the place of the stars and the place of the moving stars, which are planets, did they think that those somehow had a control upon one's life? Apparently so. So Israel had encountered this undoubtedly amongst her neighbors, and perhaps was wondering if that was for them. We may derive this from the phrase, something I never commanded. He says, don't worship that which I have not commanded. It might well have been that some within the nation were actually teaching that God had commanded the worship of the heavenly bodies and were attempting to get others to follow in their practice by ascribing it to him. Now, from an ancient viewpoint, you could understand this. They understood that the tides of the ocean were somehow related to the moon. I mean, they saw things that happened time and again, and they began to make a correlation. Say, oh, okay, well, if that has some control upon us, maybe all of the stars and all the planets do. We know that a similar heresy plagued the nation throughout her history and was likewise a threatening foe among the communities of the way in the early centuries. Paul speaks of the elemental things of the world, which characterized pagan religion and which continue to be a problem among some of the believing communities. These elemental things of the world may well be a reference, I can't be dogmatic on it, but I think it's very possible, be a reference to the notion that the heavenly bodies, sun, moon, and stars, governed the lives of the people. We know that early Gnosticism gave much credence to such astrology, and that the apostles taught against such practice and belief, based, no doubt, upon the very commandments of Torah found in our text. Likewise, our society is more and more given to astrology and the occult, from which it springs. The so-called New Age movement, which is actually not new at all, lays great stress upon the mystical and astrological powers of the planets and stars. Instead of seeing that these were created to give glory to God, they are turned into gods themselves. As those who are called into communion with God through the work of our Messiah, we must give due diligence not to allow any such idolatrous notions to take root in our hearts. Horoscopes, astrological signs, fortune-telling, and all such things are detestable to God and should be so to us as well. I remember as a young boy, in our paper, we'd get the paper every morning, there was a horoscope in there. And I remember looking at it one time and asking my dad what that is, and he said, it's idolatry. Don't read it. Skip past it. The punishment for idolatry as prescribed in our Parashah is severe, but the road to its enactment is just nonetheless. A person could not be put to death except in the face of 2 or 3 witnesses. And then these witnesses must be so sure of their testimony that they would, as Sherry has pointed out, be willing to throw the first stone. Thus, in the face of a severe punishment, there is an equal safeguard against the possible misuse of power at the hands of the judges. And why should the idolaters be put to death? So that the rest of the nation would fear and not follow in their errant ways. Apparently, capital punishment is designed to help keep the offense from spreading. Yes, in God's economy of things, capital punishment is both a satisfying of his justice as well as a deterrent to such sins. That's kind of been given up in our day, that capital punishment is not a deterrent. Well, obviously, we don't have the power of capital punishment in many cases, right? So how do we apply this? We apply it by simply saying, don't allow the things of the world to captivate our thoughts, to captivate our time, and so forth and so on. Don't spend our time ingesting the idolatry of our world. So, what does this tell us about ourselves as created beings? It tells us this, that like it or not, we are affected by the societal changes that happen around us. God knew that allowing idolatry to go unchecked would inevitably lead the nation as a whole into the despicable practice. What we look at most and think about most often is what we will inevitably become. As one thinks in his soul, it doesn't say heart, it says soul, so is he. And one preacher told me one time long ago, it is psychologically demonstrable that one becomes like that at which he most often gazes. Go to page 6 of your notes at the top. Our Torah portion also gives other clear requirements for a king in Israel. He cannot be a foreigner, that is a no-kri, which usually describes someone from a pagan nation who was still identified with paganism, but was to come from the midst of your brethren. Likewise, the appointed king was not to multiply horses, which means he was not to build such an army as to cause him to rely upon his own military strength rather than upon the power of God. He was not to use his royal position to amass wealth, nor was he to multiply wives, which most likely refers to making political alliances through marriage to daughters of other kings. It's well known that in the ancient Near East, there would be marriages between a king and another king's daughter. He would never even see the daughter, and never even be in the same location. They would just have a legal wedding, and that would link the two nations together, because now the two kings are related through marriage. Such political, of course, Solomon did all of these, didn't he? So wisdom, he was wise in the sense that he had a lot of knowledge, but he was not wise in the sense that he didn't use his knowledge for the right things. Such political alliances could lead to the compromising the clear and discriminating laws of God. How was the king to assure that he would fulfill the righteous requirements of his royal position? He was to have his own copy of the Torah, written by himself before the priest to assure accuracy, I take it, and was to study it. It shall be with him, literally, and to read it constantly, so that as he governed, he would do so in accordance with God's divine revelation. In other words, the proper discharge of his office could only occur through his personal acquaintance with the Torah and his willingness to submit to its precepts and commandments. It is interesting that he was to write a copy of the Torah himself. Why? I can tell you this from experience. And when I was in college, music major, you know what some of our professors made us do? They made us copy a score of Beethoven. They made us copy a score of Bach. You know what happens when you copy a score? You say, you say, wait a minute, I saw that somewhere else. Oh yeah, that's over here too. Wait a minute, over here it's the same, but it's upside down. And you're thinking, that's amazing. Then you listen to it again and you say, that's the theme. Then he turns it upside down over here. And you go back and you say to the professor, they say, what did you find, Tim? Tell us what you found. Well, I found this leitmotif. I found this small little piece, and it's repeated 6 or 7 times, and it's found upside down, or inverted, we say. Inverted 3 or 4 times here. He said, exactly. Good. That's what you're supposed to. But I would have never known that if I hadn't copied the score. You know what happens when you copy the Bible? You write it down? You see it in a way that, you read it in a way that you remember it. It's in writing his own copy in the presence of the Levites, he was personally acknowledging each and every letter, and thus affirming that the whole of the Torah was that by which he would be governed. He could never claim in the future that something in the Torah had been added or deleted, for the copy he had was the product of his own hand in the presence of the Levites. Here we see the emphasis upon the utter integrity and authority of the written text of the Torah. Moreover, we read nothing here about a supposed unwritten tradition that accompanied the written Torah and which was supposedly necessary for the obeying of the Torah, which the rabbis, the rabbinic literature says you don't know the Bible unless you read our interpretation of it. Had such a body of tradition been passed on by Moses, they say that it was given to Moses at Sinai and passed on orally. Why do they say that? They wanted to have authority. Everybody knows that that's not the case. I talked with an Orthodox rabbi one time and I said, do you really believe that God gave the whole of the Talmud and the Mishnah to Moses at Sinai? He said, no, of course not. Nobody believes that. I said, why do you keep teaching it then? He said, so our bar and bat mitzvahs will follow what we're saying. I mean, he just was forthright about it. Well, if such a tradition had been given to Moses, surely the king would have been required to know this unwritten oral law as well. But rather, the sole rule of authority noted in our text is the written Torah. Now turn to your back page and we'll close this off. Why was there such clear identification of what a king was to do and not to do? Because ultimately it was talking to us about Yeshua. Yeshua is ultimately the king, right? Okay? Look at the table on page 8. He must be an Israelite, not a foreigner. What do we read in Romans 1:3? Concerning his son, who was born of a descendant of David according to the flesh. Why is it important that Yeshua be a descendant of David? Because he's king. The king is not to amass wealth. 2 Corinthians 8:9, for you know the grace of our Lord Messiah Yeshua, that though he was rich, yet for his sake he became poor, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. He's not to rely upon military strength, that is, increase the number of horses. Yeshua answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. He's not to multiply wives. Husband, love your wives, just as Messiah also loved the assembly and gave himself up for her. It doesn't say assemblies. He is the husband of one wife. And that wife is metaphorically all of those who are believers. And finally, the king is to know and follow the Torah. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. He fulfills all of the requirements of a king that were laid down. And I think that's why those requirements were given, so that we would continue to look for that ultimate king who satisfies all of those requirements to perfection.